The 911 operator's voice, a tinny echo, crackled through the phone line. 911, what's your emergency? A sharp, nasally voice, laced with frantic urgency, shot back, there's a dangerous trespasser in my neighborhood. The dispatcher's tone shifted, hardening with concern. Can you describe the suspect? Yes. He's a man standing in my driveway. A beat of silence hung in the air. Wait. You mean your driveway? The dispatcher inquired, a hint of confusion creeping into their voice. No, but it should be mine, Brenda Thompson declared, her voice rising in indignation. The dispatcher had fielded their share of ridiculous calls over the years, but this one? This one had to be right up there with the dumbest. Little did Brenda Thompson know, the man she was hysterically calling 911 on wasn't just any random trespasser. He was Officer David Miller, an active-duty police officer standing squarely on his own property. David had only been living in the neighborhood for less than a month, and already, the siren call of retirement in the quiet countryside was sounding increasingly appealing. He had deliberately bought his home just outside the Homeowners Association's HOA jurisdiction. He had zero interest in dealing with absurd regulations about mailbox colors or the precise placement of garbage cans. The property was perfect, a spacious driveway, quiet neighbors or so he thought, and best of all, no HOA breathing down his neck. But Brenda Thompson, the self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood standards, had made it her personal mission to drag his property under the HOA's iron fist, despite it never being part of their territory. From the moment he moved in, Brenda had been a persistent, escalating annoyance. It started with saccharine sweet reminders about neighborhood aesthetics, which quickly morphed into full-blown, imperious demands. First, it was his mailbox not HOA approved, of course. Then, his marked police cruiser in the driveway was deemed intimidating and an eyesore. Finally, the color of his house was declared not harmonious with the street. David, a man of law and order but also common sense, had ignored every single one of her ridiculous pronouncements. This, naturally, infuriated Brenda to no end. She tried everything in her arsenal, passive-aggressive letters, fines that held no legal weight, and even a fabricated complaint to the city about a phantom code violation. Nothing stuck. So, when she spotted his cruiser in his own driveway that morning, a vein in her forehead visibly throbbed. Enough was enough. She was going to teach this interloping officer a lesson. And so, she did what any unhinged HOA president would do, she dialed 911. David was inside, savoring his morning coffee, when he caught the faint whine of sirens in the distance. His police scanner, ever vigilant, had already picked up something interesting, a suspicious trespasser in his neighborhood, a dangerous man lurking in the driveway. David smirked, a slow grin spreading across his face. Oh, this is going to be good. He stepped outside casually, just as two patrol cars, lights flashing, screeched to a halt in front of his house. Two officers emerged, their eyes scanning for the supposed menace. And there she was, Brenda Thompson, standing on her lawn, radiating self-righteous fury, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing emphatically towards David. There. That man. Arrest him for trespassing. The officers turned their heads, and upon seeing David, a wave of disbelief followed by barely suppressed laughter washed over them. Wait, one of them coughed, struggling to maintain a professional demeanor. Brenda, are you telling us that this trespasser is Officer David Miller? Brenda's self-righteous fury faltered for a fleeting moment, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, but she quickly recovered, her chin jutting out defiantly. I don't care if he's the Pope. He's illegally parked, and this is private HOA property. David folded his arms, shaking his head slowly. Brenda, I've told you a dozen times, my property is not part of the HOA. Brenda's eyes twitched, a dangerous sign. It should be. One of the officers sighed, rubbing his temples with a weary hand. Ma'am, you can't call 911 just because you don't like someone's car being parked in their own driveway. Brenda gasped, as if she had just been personally insulted by the highest authority. "Excuse me? Are you refusing to uphold the law? This is a crime." The other officer shook his head. "No, ma'am, this is not a crime." "But you did just file a false police report." "That is a crime." Brenda's face drained of color, her carefully applied makeup suddenly looking stark against her pale skin. What?" David pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the record button. "Don't worry, Brenda, this is all on video. You called 911 under false pretenses. That could land you in serious trouble." For the first time, Brenda hesitated, a flicker of fear in her eyes. She glanced around, realizing that several of her neighbors had started peeking through their windows, drawn by the unfolding drama. But Brenda Thompson wasn't about to lose her iron grip on this community, not now, not ever. Instead of backing down, she doubled down, her voice rising in pitch. "I don't care what you say. That car is a violation of HOA policy. No official vehicles can be parked on private property overnight. The neighborhood agreed to this rule." David raised an eyebrow, a wry smile playing on his lips. "I didn't agree to it, Brenda." Brenda huffed, her face flushed with indignation. "That's because you're not part of the HOA." She stopped abruptly, realizing her blunder. David smirked, enjoying her discomfort immensely. "Exactly." One of the officers chuckled, unable to contain himself. "So, you do admit he's not part of the HOA, meaning your rules don't apply to him?" Brenda's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, her face turning a furious shade of crimson. David crossed his arms, leaning against his cruiser. "This was fun, Brenda, but you're wasting police resources, and you've just made my day." The officers gave Brenda a final, stern warning about the serious consequences of making false police reports, but they let her off with a lecture, much to David's slight disappointment. Brenda, however, wasn't about to let this go. As the patrol cars pulled away, she pointed a perfectly manicured finger, trembling with rage, at David. "You may have won today, Officer Miller, but mark my words, this isn't over." David simply took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "I sure hope not, Brenda. This is way more entertaining than daytime TV." Brenda stormed off, muttering something about protecting the integrity of the HOA. David laughed to himself. This woman had just called 911 on a police officer over a driveway. What was she going to try next? He had no idea, but one thing was for certain, this was going to be a very interesting neighborhood to live in. David leaned casually against the hood of his cruiser, still sipping his coffee, as the officers drove off. The sun had barely crested the horizon, yet Brenda Thompson had already managed to make a complete fool of herself in front of the entire neighborhood. But David knew Brenda. She wasn't the type to back down just because she got embarrassed. If anything, this was only the beginning. He walked back inside and grabbed his police radio, flicking it on out of curiosity. It didn't take long for the chatter to come through. "Hey, did you guys hear about the crazy 911 call over in Fairview Estates?" One officer's voice crackled. "Some lady called about a trespasser in a driveway." "Was it Officer Miller?" Another voice chimed in, followed by a burst of laughter. "Yep. Claimed he was illegally parked in her neighborhood. Man, I wish I was on that call." "Did you guys charge her?" "Nah, just a warning. But she's mad as hell. She's definitely going to try something else." David chuckled and turned off the radio. It was only a matter of time before this incident spread through the entire department. He wouldn't be surprised if someone printed out Brenda vs. Officer Miller posters and stuck them in the precinct break room. And right on cue, his phone buzzed with a text message. "Sergeant Reynolds heard you had a little run-in with an HOA overlord this morning," the text read. "You good?" David smirked and fired back, "Oh yeah, Sergeant. Best part of my day so far." "Well, you might want to brace yourself," Sergeant Reynolds replied. "Word is, she's already trying to escalate things." David sighed. He didn't doubt it for a second. Sure enough, just an hour later, his email inbox exploded with neighborhood notices from the HOA. Subject: Urgent HOA Policy Enforcement. Dear Fairview Estates residents, it has come to our attention that non-residents have been parking unauthorized vehicles in our neighborhood. This is an unacceptable violation of our community standards and a direct threat to the safety and integrity of our neighborhood. Effective immediately, all law enforcement vehicles must be parked out of public view to maintain the aesthetic harmony of our community. Failure to comply will result in disciplinary action from the HOA board. Sincerely, Brenda Thompson, HOA President. David nearly choked on his coffee. She was banning police vehicles now? Was this woman serious? He scrolled down and saw that she had blind carbon copied every resident in the neighborhood, painting him as some kind of menace to the community. David sighed and muttered to himself, "All right, Brenda, you want to play games? Let's play." He didn't bother responding to the email. Instead, he printed it out, grabbed his badge, and drove straight to the HOA office. The moment he walked through the door, Brenda, who had clearly been expecting him, was already standing behind her desk, arms crossed, smirking like she had just won a major victory. "Well, Officer Miller," she said smugly, her voice dripping with condescension, "I assume you're here to move your vehicle?" David leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, a calm but dangerous look in his eyes. "Brenda, do you even hear yourself? You just sent a neighborhood-wide email banning police vehicles from a public neighborhood. What's next? Fire trucks?" Brenda didn't even flinch, her resolve seemingly unbreakable. "This is private HOA property. We have the right to enforce our rules." David nodded slowly. "Okay, let's test that theory." He pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and put it on speaker. "Code enforcement, how can I help you?" A voice answered on the other end. Brenda's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of dawning horror. "Yeah, this is Officer David Miller. I've got an HOA here trying to enforce illegal vehicle bans on public roads. Could you send someone down?" Brenda froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. You wouldn't dare." David raised an eyebrow, a hint of steel in his voice. "Brenda, you called 911 on a police officer. You think I won't call code enforcement on you?" Brenda's face went pale as a ghost. Within 30 minutes, a city inspector arrived. The inspector, a gruff-looking man named Mike, walked into the HOA office, already looking thoroughly annoyed. "All right, what nonsense am I dealing with today?" David handed him a copy of Brenda's email. Mike skimmed it, then looked up at Brenda, his expression incredulous. "Ma'am, are you out of your mind?" Brenda straightened her posture, her voice laced with indignation. "I don't appreciate your tone." Mike scoffed, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Well, I don't appreciate HOAs acting like they run the government. You can ban emergency vehicles from public roads, and you sure as hell can't dictate what a police officer does on his own property." Brenda tried to argue, her voice trembling with outrage. "But the HOA bylaws—" Mike cut her off, his voice firm. "The HOA bylaws are not legally enforceable on public roads. In fact, you just violated city code by even attempting to enforce this rule. That's a fine of up to $5,000. Brenda gasped, clutching her chest. "You can't do that." Mike smirked, a hint of satisfaction in his eyes. "Oh, I can, and I will. Expect a formal citation in the mail." David had to bite back his laughter as Brenda visibly shook with rage. "This is an outrage," she snapped, her voice shrill. "I am simply trying to uphold the standards of this community." Mike rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed. "Lady, I've dealt with plenty of HOA presidents in my time, but you might just be the worst. And if I hear one more complaint about you harassing residents, especially a police officer, I'll personally recommend a citywide investigation into your HOA." David grinned, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle. "Sounds fair to me." Brenda was fuming, her face a mask of pure fury. She grabbed the HOA rulebook from her desk and slammed it down with a resounding thud. "You haven't heard the last of this." Mike sighed, turning to David. "Officer Miller, you let me know if she tries anything else. I'd be happy to shut this place down." David gave him a casual salute. "We will, Mike." As the inspector left, David leaned towards Brenda's desk, a triumphant glint in his eyes. "See, Brenda? You should have just let me enjoy my driveway in peace." Brenda's eye twitched, her composure finally cracking. "This isn't over." David smirked. "Oh, I hope not." He walked out of the office, already wondering what Brenda's next move would be. She was too petty to back down, and David was more than ready for round 3. David knew Brenda wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. The HOA president had just been publicly humiliated in front of a city inspector, caught illegally trying to enforce rules she had no power to impose. If she had any sense, she would have backed off and left him alone. But Brenda had never been known for her sense. The first sign that she was plotting revenge came the next morning. David stepped outside to grab his morning coffee and newspaper when he noticed something odd. A neatly folded HOA violation notice sat on his windshield. David laughed out loud, the sheer audacity of it almost comical. He picked up the notice and read, "Violation, unauthorized vehicle storage description. Police vehicles are considered commercial property and may not be stored in residential driveways overnight. Please remove immediately or face a fine of $250 per day." Signed, Brenda Thompson, HOA president. David shook his head in disbelief. She was actually trying this again? Now, a normal person might have gone straight to the HOA office to confront Brenda, but David wasn't a normal person. He was a cop. He knew the best way to deal with Brenda was to let her dig her own grave. So, instead of responding, David did nothing. And sure enough, by noon, his email inbox exploded. Brenda was rallying the HOA minions. She had mobilized the HOA loyalists, and emails flooded in from concerned residents about how David's police cruiser was bringing down property values. Someone even went so far as to claim it was making the neighborhood feel unsafe, as if a police presence was a bad thing. Then came the anonymous letters, slipped under his door, stuffed into his mailbox, each one more ridiculous than the last. "We don't feel comfortable with your vehicle here. This is a family neighborhood, not a crime-ridden city block. Your presence is intimidating to children." David had to laugh. These people were so afraid of Brenda, they weren't even signing their names. And then the petty vandalism started. At first, it was subtle. Someone scattered leaves and trash near his driveway in an attempt to make it look messy. Then came the eggshells, cracked near his tires. And finally, the most ridiculous of all, someone taped a giant, crudely drawn HOA fine notice to his garage door. David walked out, peeled it off, and smirked at the security camera on his porch. "Oh, Brenda," he muttered, a dangerous glint in his eyes, "you are really asking for it." When the vandalism didn't work, Brenda switched tactics. She weaponized city bureaucracy. Over the next 3 days, David received a noise complaint from the city about excessive siren usage. He hadn't even turned on his lights, a zoning violation for operating a commercial business from home. Apparently, being a cop was now a business, and a code enforcement notice claiming his fence was an inch too high. David knew exactly who was behind it, and he wasn't about to let it slide. He filed public records requests with the city and confirmed what he already knew. Every single complaint had been submitted anonymously, but the handwriting on the forms, the same perfectly neat, looping cursive as Brenda's signature on her tyrannical HOA notices, was undeniable. David grinned. He finally had real evidence. It was time to play. David waited until the next HOA meeting, held in the neighborhood clubhouse. Normally, he avoided these ridiculous gatherings like the plague, but this time, he had a plan. The room was packed. Brenda had clearly invited as many HOA loyalists as possible. They all sat with smug expressions on their faces, as if they'd already won. Brenda stood at the front, her precious HOA rulebook clutched in her hand. "Before we begin," she announced, her voice ringing with self-importance, "I'd like to bring up a matter of extreme importance. Officer Miller's vehicle continues to violate HOA guidelines, and we must take immediate action." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. David stood up, a disarming smile on his face. "Actually, Brenda, I'd like to address that." Brenda narrowed her eyes, a flicker of annoyance crossing her features. "There's nothing to address. You're in violation." David reached into his bag and pulled out printed copies of the fake complaints he had obtained from the city. He held them up for everyone to see. "You see, Brenda, I did a little digging. Turns out someone's been filing fraudulent complaints against me with the city." Brenda's face twitched, a hint of panic in her eyes. What are you implying?" David smirked, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not implying anything, Brenda. I'm stating a fact. These complaints all came from one person, and wouldn't you know it, the handwriting matches exactly to the notices you've been leaving on my car." The room fell dead silent. Brenda's mouth opened and closed again. She looked like a fish gasping for air. David continued, his voice resonating through the stunned silence. "So, here's where we stand. You filed fraudulent complaints. You vandalized my property. And you've harassed a police officer." Gasps spread through the room. A few of Brenda's most ardent loyalists started inching away from her. David went on, "I could report this to the police department and the city attorney. That means fines, maybe even criminal charges for falsifying reports." Brenda's face went ghost white. "Or," David paused dramatically, letting the tension in the room build, "you can drop this whole thing and admit you were wrong." Brenda glared daggers at him, her entire grip on the HOA slipping, but she was too proud, too stubborn to admit defeat. Instead, she tried one last desperate move. This is harassment," she sputtered, her voice shaking. "I am a respected HOA president. I will sue you for defamation." David laughed, a genuine, hearty laugh that echoed through the clubhouse. "Go ahead, Brenda. But before you do..." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his body camera, holding it up for all to see. "I've got everything on video." Brenda's knees nearly buckled. The room erupted into whispers. Wait, she was faking complaints? She really tried to frame a cop? She's out of control. The HOA board members looked at each other, their faces itched with panic. Finally, one of them, a nervous-looking man named Tom, stood up. I think we need to discuss this in private," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. David smirked. "You do that, Tom. But while you're at it, maybe ask yourselves if Brenda is really fit to run this HOA." Brenda gasped audibly, her eyes wide with betrayal. David gave her a wink, a silent promise of more to come. "See you around, neighbor." He walked out, knowing he had just delivered a knockout punch. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because Brenda was desperate, and desperate people, they made mistakes. David knew he had rattled Brenda. She had been publicly exposed for filing fraudulent complaints, weaponizing city resources, and harassing a police officer. The HOA board had been forced into a crisis meeting, desperately trying to salvage what little credibility they had left. But Brenda wasn't done. If anything, her desperation was about to make her even more reckless. And that's when the HOA made its fatal mistake, the illegal towing incident. David had just returned home from a late shift, exhausted and ready to crash for a few hours. He pulled into his driveway, parked his cruiser, and walked inside. Barely 20 minutes later, he heard a strange noise outside, the unmistakable rumble of a tow truck. David frowned, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He peeked through his window and saw a man in an orange vest hooking chains onto his police cruiser. For a moment, he thought he was seeing things. Then it clicked. Brenda. David bolted outside, adrenaline surging through his veins. Hey! What the hell do you think you're doing? The tow truck driver, startled, hesitated for a second before regaining his composure. I got an order from the HOA to tow this vehicle. David raised an eyebrow, his voice dangerously calm. Oh yeah? You got paperwork for that? The driver pulled out a clipboard and handed it over, his eyes darting nervously towards David's police uniform. Sure enough, it was an HOA towing authorization order, signed by Brenda Thompson. David grinned, a predatory gleam in his eyes. Brenda had just made a massive mistake. He pulled out his badge, the metallic glint catching the morning sun. You know what's funny? I'm a police officer, and this is a legally owned government vehicle. If you hook that winch up and try to tow it, you're committing grand theft auto. The tow truck driver froze, his face paling. David stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. And you know what else? Since Brenda filed this order knowingly and fraudulently, that means she's now an accessory to the crime. The driver's face drained of color. I didn't know. I was just following orders. David smirked, his eyes like chips of ice. Yeah, well, following illegal orders doesn't protect you from the law. But lucky for you, I'm feeling generous. How about you call Brenda right now and tell her to get her rear end over here? The driver fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking, and frantically dialed Brenda's number. David folded his arms, waiting, a grim satisfaction washing over him. After a few rings, a shrill voice screeched through the phone. What is it? The driver stammered, his voice trembling. Ma'am, we have a problem. The car you asked me to tow belongs to a police officer. He says this is illegal. I don't care. Brenda snapped, her voice laced with fury. You have the order. Tow the car. David chuckled, a dark, menacing sound. Put her on speaker. The driver hesitated, his eyes pleading with David, but David gave him a look that brooked no argument. He reluctantly pressed the speakerphone button. Brenda's voice blasted through the truck's speakers, loud and abrasive. I don't care if he's a cop. I want that car gone, now. If he doesn't like it, he can go cry about it to someone who cares. David leaned towards the phone, his voice deceptively calm. Hey, Brenda. Silence. Then, a sharp intake of breath. David? David grinned, ear to ear. Yeah, Brenda. You're on speakerphone. And by the way, I'm recording this. The tow truck driver, realizing just how deep in trouble he was, immediately unhooked the chains and jumped back into his truck as if it were on fire. I'm out. I'm not getting arrested for this. He peeled out of the neighborhood at top speed, leaving a trail of dust and disbelief. David watched as the truck disappeared around the corner, then he turned his attention to Brenda, who was probably hyperventilating on the other end of the call. Well, Brenda, David said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, I hope you enjoyed committing a felony today. Brenda hung up instantly. David burst out laughing, the sound echoing through the quiet morning air. He walked back inside, already dialing his precinct. It was time to escalate. The next morning, David received a call from the precinct commander. Commander Reynolds' voice, usually calm and collected, held a note of incredulity. Miller, you want to explain why I got a report about an HOA trying to steal a police vehicle? David chuckled. Sir, you wouldn't believe me if I told you. He proceeded to explain the entire saga, Brenda's fake complaints, her relentless HOA harassment, and now, the attempted theft of a police cruiser. Reynolds listened in stunned silence. Jesus Christ, Miller, Commander Reynolds finally said, a hint of amusement in his voice. All right, consider this handled. I'll send a unit down to have a chat with your lovely HOA president. David smirked. Brenda had no idea what was coming. An hour later, 2 uniformed officers arrived at Brenda's house. David watched from his porch, enjoying his coffee, as Brenda opened the door, only to freeze in pure terror at the sight of the officer standing on her doorstep. Mrs. Thompson? one of the officers said, his voice polite but firm. "We need to have a talk about some very serious accusations regarding an attempted vehicle theft and misuse of HOA authority." Brenda stammered, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. I don't know what you're talking about. This is harassment." The officer raised an eyebrow, a knowing look in his eyes. "Is it? Because we have a recorded phone call that says otherwise." Brenda's face turned an impressive shade of red. By now, half the neighborhood had come outside, drawn by the commotion, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of shock and amusement. Brenda glared daggers across the street at David, but he just gave her a friendly little wave, a picture of innocent enjoyment. And that's when Brenda made her final, catastrophic mistake. She pointed a shaking finger at the officers, her voice rising to a shriek. "Why, you're in on it. This is a conspiracy. That man," she jabbed a finger towards David, her face contorted with rage, "is abusing his power. I demand you arrest him." The officers looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them. Then, one of them pulled out a citation book. "Mrs. Thompson, since you're refusing to cooperate, we'll be issuing you a formal charge for filing a false police report, along with a city's citation for unauthorized enforcement of HOA policies." Brenda's entire body sagged, the fight draining out of her. The neighborhood murmured, a wave of disapproval washing over her. Some of Brenda's most loyal supporters started whispering to each other, their faces etched with embarrassment. Others flat out turned and walked away. And just like that, Brenda's reign of terror, her iron grip on the HOA, began to crumble. That night, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. This time, Brenda wasn't leading it. Instead, Tom, the nervous board member who had previously seemed terrified of Brenda, stood up, his voice surprisingly firm. "Due to overwhelming complaints and legal issues," he announced, his gaze sweeping across the room, "the board has unanimously voted to remove Brenda Thompson as HOA president." Gasps rippled through the room. Brenda shot to her feet, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. "You can't do this to me." Tom cleared his throat, a newfound confidence in his voice. "Actually, Brenda, per HOA bylaws, we can. Effective immediately, you are banned from all HOA decision-making activities." Brenda looked around the room, her eyes pleading with her former allies, but no one met her gaze. They all knew which way the wind was blowing now. David, sitting in the back, simply sipped his coffee, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. Brenda had destroyed herself, and it was glorious to watch. Brenda sat frozen, her face drained of all color, as the HOA board officially stripped her of her presidency. The room was silent except for the quiet murmurs of neighbors who had once backed her but now saw the writing on the wall. David, sitting casually in the back, sipped his coffee and watched the show unfold. "Why? You can't do this." Brenda finally sputtered, her voice barely a whisper. "I am the HOA president. I built this community." Tom, the nervous board member who had suddenly found his backbone, cut her off. "Brenda, we've already filed the paperwork with the state HOA association. You are no longer in charge. You're done." Brenda turned to her remaining allies for support, but they all avoided her gaze. They knew siding with her now was a one-way ticket to disaster. "You can just..." she started again, her voice rising in desperation, but Tom didn't let her finish. "We also reviewed the HOA's financial records." Brenda froze, her eyes widening in panic. David smirked. "Here it comes." Tom cleared his throat, his expression grim. "And it seems that over the past 3 years, there have been irregularities in the budget. Payments that were never approved by the board. Funds allocated to administrative fees that don't have corresponding receipts." Brenda's eyes widened in panic. That's ridiculous. I was just managing the budget as needed." Another board member, a woman named Linda, crossed her arms, her voice cold and accusatory. "Brenda, you used HOA funds to pay for landscaping at your house. Gasps spread through the room. Linda continued, flipping through a file. We also found HOA money spent on a contractor who only worked on your property. David raised an eyebrow, impressed by the sheer audacity of it all. Wow! She wasn't just power-hungry. She was straight-up corrupt. Brenda shook her head violently, her voice rising in hysteria. This is a witch hunt. I was keeping the neighborhood beautiful. Tom ignored her outburst. Because of these findings, the board is pressing formal charges for HOA fund mismanagement. Brenda staggered back as if she had been physically struck, her face ashen. And no, David leaned forward, enjoying this way too much. You wouldn't. Brenda, David said, his voice laced with mock sympathy, remember when you tried to falsely accuse me of a crime? Well, it looks like you're the one actually breaking the law. 2 days later, Brenda tried to fight back, the only way she knew how, by suing everyone. She filed lawsuits against the HOA board, David, and even the city itself, claiming she was being unjustly removed and that the investigation into her spending was a political attack. But there was one small problem: Brenda had no legal ground to stand on. Her attempt at suing David was dismissed instantly. Her lawsuit against the HOA board was tossed out due to overwhelming evidence of mismanagement. Her attempt to sue the city? The judge practically laughed her out of court. By the end of the week, Brenda was facing mounting legal fees, HOA fines, and an official audit of her financial records. And then came the final humiliation, the final blow. At the next HOA meeting, now led by Tom, a new rule was introduced. It was unanimously voted in: Brenda Thompson was permanently banned from participating in any HOA board position or decision-making process in Fairview Estates. David almost felt bad for her. Almost. When the decision was announced, Brenda stood up, shaking with fury, and stormed out of the clubhouse, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She didn't say a word, but David knew this wasn't the end. There was one last twist coming. A few weeks later, David was mowing his lawn when he noticed something strange. A for sale sign had popped up in front of Brenda's house. David grinned, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. He casually strolled over to a neighbor who had never liked Brenda but had always stayed quiet. "Selling the place?" David asked, a knowing smirk on his face. The neighbor chuckled. "Oh, you didn't hear? The new HOA board fined Brenda into oblivion." David raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "How bad are we talking?" The man chuckled again, clearly enjoying Brenda's downfall. "Well, remember all those unauthorized landscaping and contractor expenses? The new board forced her to pay it all back." David laughed, a hearty, genuine laugh. Brenda, the queen of fines and HOA tyranny, had been taken down by her own rules. She fought it, the neighbor continued, but the HOA's new lawyer shut her down. She couldn't afford the legal fees and the fines, so now she's selling and skipping town. David took a sip of his water, savoring every second of this poetic justice. "Yep," the neighbor said with a wide smirk, "and get this, she had to apply for an HOA violation waiver just to sell her house." David grinned ear to ear. The very HOA Brenda had weaponized against everyone was now the reason she was being forced out. The day Brenda moved out, David and a few neighbors watched from their porches as she packed up her ridiculously overpriced car, looking furious the entire time. She refused to make eye contact with anyone. As she finally drove off, tires screeching in protest, David couldn't resist. He gave her a slow, casual salute. Brenda sped off without a word, a dark cloud finally lifting from Fairview Estates. The neighborhood threw a small block party that weekend. It wasn't officially labeled a Brenda is gone celebration, but everyone knew. David enjoyed his drink, leaned back in his chair, and chuckled to himself. Brenda thought she ruled the HOA, but in the end, she was just another power-hungry fool who got exactly what she deserved. The day after Brenda sped out of Fairview Estates, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter. Like a dark cloud had finally lifted. No more ridiculous violation notices. No more threatening emails. No more Brenda. David stepped outside and took a deep breath. The air smelled like freedom. As he walked to his cruiser, a few neighbors gathered around, grinning. "Well, Officer Miller," Linda from the HOA board said, a genuine smile on her face, "I have to admit, I never thought I'd see the day." David chuckled. "You and me both, Linda." Another neighbor, an older man named Bob, snorted with laughter. "I still can't believe she fined herself out of her own house." David smirked. "I told her to stop harassing me, but she just couldn't help herself." The group laughed, the tension that had hung over the neighborhood for so long finally dissipating. And just when David thought the drama was finally over, a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of Brenda's old house. The neighbors went silent, their eyes wide with curiosity. Then, a real estate agent stepped out, followed by a man in a sharp business suit. Linda squinted, trying to get a better look. "Wait, is that?" Bob's jaw dropped, his eyes practically popping out of his head. "No freaking way." David folded his arms, a slow smile spreading across his face as he watched the man examine the property with a calculating look. Then it clicked. The new buyer was the president of the city's police union. David grinned. The new owner? The HOA's worst nightmare. By the next week, it was official. Brenda's old house had been purchased by none other than Chief David Reynolds, David's precinct commander. The neighborhood exploded with gossip. "I heard he's moving in with his whole family. Does this mean we're going to have 2 cops on the block now? This is too good." David was enjoying every second of it. One evening, Chief Reynolds himself came over, a 6-pack of beer in hand. "Miller," he said, taking a swig, "I just want you to know I got the full story about Brenda." David smirked. "Oh yeah, Chief?" Reynolds grinned, shaking his head in amusement. "Oh yeah. I read every HOA violation she filed against you. Hell, I think half the precinct knows about it by now." David laughed, the absurdity of the situation still sinking in. "So, you just happened to buy her house?" Reynolds shrugged, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Let's just say I love a good deal. The bank foreclosed on her before she could finish fighting her HOA fines. I picked it up for dirt cheap." David shook his head in disbelief. "That's poetic justice." Reynolds chuckled. "And the best part? I checked the HOA rules. Guess what?" David raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What?" Reynolds took a dramatic sip of his beer. "HOA board members have to approve any new rule changes with a majority vote." David's smirk widened. "You don't say?" Reynolds nodded, his eyes twinkling. "And as a new homeowner, I get to vote." David burst out laughing, the sound echoing through the twilight. "You're telling me you have actual power in the HOA now?" "Oh, not just that," Reynolds says, grinning ear to ear. "I just ran for HOA president." David nearly spit out his drink. "You're kidding me." Reynolds shook his head, a wide, satisfied smile on his face. "Election is next week. Guess what? I'm running unopposed." David howled with laughter. Brenda had spent years tyrannizing the neighborhood with her ridiculous HOA rules, and now, the new HOA president was his police commander. David leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. "This might be the greatest thing I've ever witnessed." Reynolds smirked. "Oh, it gets better. First thing I'm doing as HOA president?" David raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. Getting rid of those stupid parking restrictions?" Reynolds nodded. "And after that, I'm making sure Brenda is banned from ever moving back." David grinned. "Now that's a rule I can get behind." 3 weeks later, just as things were finally calming down, something unexpected happened. David was working in his front yard when a familiar, shrill voice echoed down the street. You think you've won, but you haven't." David turned, his heart sinking slightly. Brenda was back. Except this time, she looked frazzled. Her hair was a mess, her clothes were wrinkled, and she was absolutely livid. David sighed. "Brenda, what are you doing here?" Brenda stormed up, waving a piece of paper in her hand. "I have a legal right to be here. I filed an appeal against my HOA fines, and until the case is settled, I'm technically still part of this community." David blinked, momentarily stunned by her audacity. "That's not how that works, Brenda." Brenda ignored him. She marched up to Chief Reynolds' front door and started pounding on it, her face a mask of righteous indignation. "I demand a meeting with the HOA president. This is illegal." A few seconds later, Reynolds opened the door. He took one look at Brenda, sighed, and crossed his arms. "Brenda," he said in a tired voice, "you don't live here anymore." Brenda's eye twitched, a vein throbbing in her forehead. "I have rights." Reynolds smirked, a hint of steel in his voice. "Yeah, well, I have a trespassing law." Brenda froze, her mouth agape. "You step on this property again," Reynolds says, holding up his phone, "and I'll have actual police officers remove you." Brenda's face turned a furious shade of red. She opened her mouth to argue, but then she saw David standing behind Reynolds, arms crossed, a wide, triumphant grin on his face. And she snapped. "This is unfair. You're all corrupt." Reynolds raised his phone. "So, should I call the station now, or?" Brenda sputtered, then without another word, she spun around, stomped back to her beat-up car, and sped off, leaving a cloud of dust and a lingering sense of disbelief in her wake. David sighed. "Think she'll try again?" Reynolds shook his head, a look of finality on his face. "Nah. I just filed a permanent no trespassing order with the HOA. She's officially banned from the neighborhood." David laughed, a weight lifting off his shoulders. "I hope she enjoys whatever hellhole she moves to next." That night, the HOA board held a final vote. Brenda Thompson was permanently barred from ever living, visiting, or having any official involvement with Fairview Estates. David, sitting comfortably on his porch, raised his drink in a silent toast. The tyrant had fallen. The HOA, once a nightmare, was now under actual sane leadership. And David? He finally got to park his police cruiser in his driveway without some crazy woman calling 911. As he leaned back, watching the peaceful neighborhood finally free of Brenda's rule, he couldn't help but smile. Some victories? They was worth every single second of the battle. Valuable lesson: the story of Brenda and Officer Miller serves as a cautionary tale about the abuse of power, the importance of knowing your boundaries and the law, and the sweet taste of karma. Brenda's relentless harassment and attempts to control others ultimately led to her own downfall, highlighting that kindness and respect for others' property rights are always the better approach. What did you think of this story? Share your comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more entertaining stories.